When I was at my lowest ebb, a lame-legged teenager bought me and took me home. He supported me to study and sent me to learn music. But at the most important moment of my life, he ended up in prison because of me. Many years later, when Andrew was released from prison, I had already become famous all over the country. A reporter stopped him for an interview. Miss Ju said that her hit song High Mountain Andrew was written for a very important person. Is that person you? His hand hanging at his side clenched and then loosened. Finally, he denied it with a smile. Of course not. I'm just her fan. One at the age of 14 this year. I was abducted into the mountains. But no one was willing to buy me. A man about 40 years old smoked a dry tobacco pipe and looked me up and down with a curled lip. Damn it. Lao Li. What do you mean by selling a child to me? The man called Lao Li grinned foolishly. Who said that? This one is an adult. Just a bit small looking. Forget it. The man had a discerning eye. This scrawny figure. It's obvious that she can't bear children. Buying her would be a waste of money. After going around the village, no one was willing to buy me. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that I could escape this disaster. But unexpectedly I heard Lao Li and his accomplice whispering, since no one bought me, they might as well kill me and bury me in the uninhabited area at the back of the mountain. I was extremely panicked and secretly ran away while they weren't paying attention. But still, I didn't run far. In a panic, I hid in a dilapidated house. There was someone in the house. It was a thin and handsome boy. When he walked, one of his legs was a bit lame. He was much taller than me. He frowned as he looked at me and asked me who I was looking for. Before I could speak, the door was kicked open. When I was about to be taken away, the boy suddenly asked, "How much money do I need to give you if I want to keep her?" He didn't use the word buy. Finally, he bought me with 50 yuan. 50 yuan was all his worldly possessions. 2. I was an orphan originally and had no name. Enru bought me and named me Yolanda. 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 I quietly recited this name, and flowers bloomed one after another in my heart. Andrew was also an orphan. His father went to prison, and his mother ran away with someone many years ago. It was his grandfather who brought him up. But a month ago, his grandfather also passed away due to illness. Andrew and I thus became family to each other. He stopped going to school, even though the walls of his home were covered with the certificates he had won in the past. But he insisted on sending me to school. There was not much livelihood in this big mountain. He supported me by relying on those few acres of infertile fields and picking mountain delicacies on the mountain. My favorite thing to do was to cook a meal after school every day, and then squat at the door waiting for him. Watching that thin figure slowly walk down the hillside, taking deep and shallow steps in the setting sun. Winter arrived. The mountain road was already difficult to walk, and with the snow piled up, it was extremely slippery and muddy. When Andrew went up the mountain to pick mountain delicacies, he accidentally fell down the mountainside and his leg injury became more serious. The next day, while Andrew was still asleep, I carried his basket on my back and secretly went up the mountain. Fortunately, at the end of the day, the basket was almost full. I hummed a little tune and went home. I originally wanted to show off to Andrew my achievements today. However, what greeted me when I entered the door was a slap from Andrew. I held the basket and froze on the spot. "Brother, who let you go up the mountain?" He looked at me with red eyes. "Do you know it's very dangerous on the mountain?" He looked at me for a long time and took a deep breath. "Go stand in the yard. Come in when you've thought it through." "Okay." I wrapped my coat tightly and silently retreated to the yard. While I was standing as a punishment, the neighbor girl ran to me from the neighboring yard, and I stared at her legs. No matter how I looked at them, I thought it was strange. "Dora, your walking posture. Why is it so strange?" Hearing this, Dora's face suddenly changed. It was hard to tell whether the emotion that flashed across her face was sadness or embarrassment. All I saw was that she forced a smile. "I sprained my ankle. It's a bit uncomfortable to walk. As soon as she finished speaking, her chubby-faced younger brother's Akri suddenly showed his face on the wall of the neighboring yard. He smiled, with his eyebrows raised very high. Sister, it's time to tutor me in my studies. He deliberately emphasized the word, studies, very strongly. There were 3 generations in the neighbor's family, and they were the richest in the village. But old man Lee favored boys over girls. His grandson was as fat as a pig, while Dora was as thin as a stick and always had injuries on her body on weekdays. Dora's expression changed again and again. Finally, she murmured in answer. She stuffed the pastries she had stolen from home into my arms, turned around and slowly walked towards the outside of the yard. When she walked, her legs were spread wide apart and her posture was a bit awkward. For some reason, the setting sun shone on her back, and there was an inexplicable sense of loneliness that didn't match her age. 5 after that time, Andrew's leg injury was more serious, and when he walked, he was more lame than before. On the 7th day of the winter month, Andrew took me to a earthen grave. There was no tombstone, only a pile of loess. He crouched down and brushed the snow on the grave, with a gentle look. I didn't know who was buried inside and didn't dare to ask, until he took the initiative to speak. He said, "Actually, I had a sister. She is very intelligent, very clingy to me, and also very studious. There is always a tenacious streak in her. Although she is only 8 years old, she has told me more than once, brother, I must study hard and get out of this big mountain." But when it came to the hard to speak part, he suddenly choked up. After taking a deep breath, he found his voice again. "One day when I had a cold, she felt sorry for me. So while I was asleep, she carried my basket on her back and went up the mountain alone. As a result, she never came down again." Brushing off the snow, Andrew sat down on the ground in front of the grave and gently patted the grave soil with his palm. When she was found, she had been devoured by wolves. She didn't even leave a whole body. He spoke calmly, but if you listen carefully, the end of each word trembles. I finally understood why he was so angry when he found me going up the mountain alone that day. After a long time, he turned to look at me. "So this is also the reason why I must support you to study." That day when you rushed into the room, at my first sight of you, I felt as if my little sister had come back. Andrew said that my eyes are very much like those of his beloved little sister, especially the tenacious streak in the bottom of my eyes. I listened with red eyes, and then walked forward, knelt in front of the grave, and slowly hugged him. "Brother, I will get out of this big mountain for my sister." At the age of 16, I was admitted to the key high school in the county. The problem that had to be faced was the mountain road was difficult to walk and far away, so I had to live on campus. But tuition, accommodation fees, meal fees, etc., these were all very practical problems. I couldn't bear to let Enver bear all this for me again, so I decided to drop out of school. But he had already guessed my thoughts. Before the start of the new semester, he paid the tuition and accommodation fees. "Brother, where did you get the money?" He smiled and said lightly, "I sold the old house." The old house that was left to him by Grandpa. He sold the old house to old Lee next door, took the money, and secretly paid my tuition and accommodation fees. On the last night before old Lee took over the house, Andrew and I huddled on that earthen king, looking out of the window and counting the stars all night. I had been crying silently all the time. I am unlucky. In this life, I have been abandoned, adopted, and trafficked. But I am also lucky because I met Andrew. The next morning, we packed our things and moved out of this mountain village. Andrew sent me to school. He put on his only white shirt and cut his hair a little shorter with scissors, looking even more neat and tidy. He carried my luggage and walked in front. The passing girls would all look at him sideways. Although, when he walked, one of his legs limped slightly. I walked slowly, carefully observing his back and the rear. The sun was very bright that day, surrounding him, coating him with a layer of light golden light. The flower in my heart seemed to bloom. The budding love told me that it seemed that I could no longer seriously regard him as my brother. Andrew had already found a job in advance. He lied to me, saying that he worked in an office, with food and accommodation provided. And the work was easy. But every time he came to see me, the hard calluses on his palms and the faint black marks in his fingernails that couldn't be washed away no matter how hard he tried all told me he was lying to me. I was very worried about him. So when he came to school to give me money on Friday, I quietly followed him after he left. He seemed very tired, so he didn't notice me. I followed all the way to a construction site. There was a lot of dust on the construction site, and the dust was flying everywhere, making people choke. But he didn't seem to care. He skillfully put on his helmet and started to work. Andrew had inconvenient legs and feet, but he didn't do any less work than the 30 or 40-year-old co-workers around him. I stood in the corner of the construction site, clenching my fists tightly. My fingernails were deeply embedded in my palms, but the sharp pain couldn't suppress the bitterness in my heart at all. Andrew, he didn't need to be so desperate originally. He could have passed the exams and got out of that big mountain by himself, sat in the schoolroom, and welcomed his bright future. But for me, he chose the hardest way of life. The wind was very strong today. The sand and dust all over the construction site didn't get into my eyes, but I still burst into tears. I summoned up my courage and went to find Andrew's boss. I stuffed all the money Andrew gave me to him and begged him to give the money to Andrew in the name of a bonus. After hearing my story, he was silent for a long time. After a while, he smiled and asked me, "Aren't you afraid that I will embezzle this money?" I shook my head and answered honestly, "I don't think you will. Besides, you should also look down on this amount of money." The boss Surnam Chu laughed when he heard this. He was not very old either. He should be just in his early 20s. I don't know how he got to this position at his age. Okay. Don't worry. I will definitely convey the money in full. I thanked him and left. As I was about to leave, he called me back again. A business card was handed to me. "If you encounter any trouble in the future, you can call me." After hesitating for 2 seconds, I took the business card. Thank you. Charles indeed did what he said. The next day, Andrew came to my school again. He bought me milk tea and stuffed some more money into my pocket. Under the camphor tree at the school gate, he rolled the money into a ball and stuffed it into my pocket. "Brother got a bonus last night. Keep this money and buy whatever you want." The money had gone around in a circle and finally came back to me. I took out the money and counted it. 500 yuan. But the money I stuffed to Charles last night was only 200 yuan. I took out 400 yuan and stuffed it back into Andrew's pocket. Pretending to be casual, I asked, "How much bonus did you get?" 500. Charles even paid 300 out of his own pocket. At my insistence, Andrew got back 400 yuan. That day he had a rare day off and took me to play by the river. There is a river in the east of the city, named Qiang River. The river water is very clear and not too deep. It is a good place for people to camp and escape the summer heat. Andrew borrowed an electric bike from his co-worker and took me there. The road was bumpy, so I plucked up my courage and gently put my arms around his waist. Andrew is very thin, but he doesn't look weak. When I put my hand on his waist, I could clearly feel the firm touch of his abdomen. His body suddenly stiffened a little. But he didn't say anything. He didn't ride fast. Along the way, the gentle breeze blew, and I could smell the scent on him, a faint smell of sweat mixed with the smell of soap. And when the wind blew again, I could also smell a very faint smell of cigarettes. Working on the construction site is very tiring, and Andrew has also learned to smoke from those co-workers. But his addiction to cigarettes doesn't seem to be very big. I have seen the cigarette packs sticking out of his pockets several times. It is also the cheapest kind on the market. On the road, neither of us said a word. I quietly buried my face in his back and couldn't help thinking in my heart that I hoped this road could be longer. Even longer. However, no matter how long the road is, it will always come to an end. I don't know how long it took, but the electric bike stopped. And as soon as I turned my head, I saw the clear river water. The sun in the afternoon was not so scorching. Andrew and I walked along the river and chatted softly. I don't know where the courage came from, but suddenly I asked him, "Brother, have you met any girl you like at work?" He was stunned for a moment. "No. Why did you suddenly ask this?" I shook my head and didn't speak. After a few seconds, I heard Andrew ask me softly, "Have you met a boy you like at school?" Suddenly my heart beat a little faster. After hesitating again and again, I still nodded slowly. "But it's not a boy in school. It's him. Actually, there are not no boys chasing me in the class. There are quite a few. However, Andrew is like a big mountain standing in front of me, making it impossible for me to see others. With him here, how could I like those male classmates in puberty with fickle minds at school?" I hesitated for a long time, but still didn't dare to say what was on my mind, until I felt a weight on top of my head. It was Andrew's hand on my hair. He gently rubbed it and said softly, "You've grown up. It's normal to like a male classmate if you do. But before you are admitted to college, you should still put your feelings aside and focus on your studies. You know?" I opened my mouth, wanting to explain that the person I liked was not a male classmate. But after hesitating for a long time, I still couldn't say it. Finally, I could only nod my head and say yes softly. I took off my shoes and socks and walked in the water by the ankle-deep stream. Not far away, a group of children were splashing water and having fun. And from time to time some water splashed over to our side. It was very lively. I looked at Andrew standing by the river and waved to him. "Brother, come here." When he walked up to me, I suddenly scooped up a handful of water and splashed it at him. The water splashed his hair wet. But he wasn't angry. Instead, he laughed and also scooped up water and splashed it at me. For the first time, we played without any scruples. Some of my clothes were wet, shined by the setting sun. The thin wet clothes clung to the curves of my body and were almost transparent. Andrew took a look and was stunned. He hurriedly went ashore and took the coat he had hung on the handlebars of the bike and put it over my shoulders. He coughed lightly, and his expression seemed a little uncomfortable. "Let's go back." It was getting dark. Andrew rode the bike to take me back to school. However, halfway there, the bike suddenly broke down. There was no choice but to push the bike. This area was remote, and on the way we only met one taxi. And it was full. By the time we pushed all the way back, it was already past the school's curfew time. Fortunately, it was Saturday today. Andrew could only call my head teacher and made up an excuse to ask for leave. We had no place to stay, and his dormitory was shared by several big guys. So, as a last resort, he could only take me to a small inn near the school. The accommodation cost here on weekends is always a little higher. A bit expensive. To save money, we rented one room. Andrew has always been a gentleman. He spread his clothes on the floor, preparing to sleep on the ground. I forcibly dragged him onto the bed. "The floor tiles are too cold. Come and sleep on the bed. It's not like we haven't slept on the same king mat before." Andrew couldn't resist me and had to come up. In the room with the lights off, he clung to the edge of the bed and deliberately piled the quilt between us. I don't know why. Obviously, it's not the first time we've slept in the same bed. But this time, I always feel extremely nervous. Maybe it's because we've both grown up. In these 2 years, I've grown a lot taller, and my body has gradually changed from being skinny in the past to having curves. Andrew has lost weight and grown taller. The long-term construction site life has made him lose some of his delicateness and look more mature. It seems that we are no longer the thin and scrawny brother-sister pair in that small mountain village at the beginning. I lay on my side and quietly looked at his profile in the dark. My eyes outlined the contours of his eyebrows and eyes through the air. How I wish time could stop right here. 10 Andrew. In the dark. I softly called his name. This was the first time I called him by his name directly. He was obviously stunned for a moment too. He wasn't annoyed. Instead, he smiled. What's the matter? I took a deep breath. Because of nervousness. My fingers unconsciously clutched the corner of my clothes. I have someone I like. It's you. However, there was no response from the side for a long time. A long time passed. So long that when I even thought he had fallen asleep, a very light snoring sound actually came from the side. Andrew had really fallen asleep. I was disappointed. But I couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. By the moonlight outside the window, I leaned over and peeked at him quietly. Andrew had a very handsome face. Like a clear breeze and bright moon. Every contour was just right. I wanted to trace his eyebrows and eyes with my fingers. Touch them from a distance. But I never dared to let my hand fall. I don't know how long I stared at him. I summoned up my courage. Pressed my hands on the bed surface. And gently leaned over. I kissed him on the lips. Like a dragonfly skimming the water. I ended the kiss in a flurry and lay back on the other side of the bed. His lips were so soft. My heart couldn't calm down for a long time. Suddenly, I regretted a little. Andrew once said that the reason he took me in was that I looked very much like his sister. He really had been treating me like a sister all this time. But I had secretly defiled him without Andrew knowing. I was so bad. That day, I lay back on the other side of the bed and tossed and turned with regret for a long time before falling asleep. In a half asleep and half awake state. I seemed to hear a very light sigh beside me. After a pause, he chuckled softly again. The next morning, Andrew woke me up very early. While there were still few pedestrians on the road, he sent me to the school gate. He stuffed the warm steamed buns into my hands, along with a cup of soy milk. Go to the classroom to eat. Have a rest after eating, and then go to class. I nodded in response. But suddenly the scene from last night came to my mind. On the hazy moonlit night, in the narrow and cramped room, I secretly kissed him. My face instantly turned red. I turned around and ran with the buns in my hand. After running a few steps, I told him to buy some buns for himself too. He said yes with a smile. But when I stood at the school gate and watched him turn into the steamed bun shop next to the breakfast shop and come out again, he was only carrying a few steamed buns in his hand. In the classroom, I ate 2 small steamed buns and hid the rest in the desk drawer, preparing to save them for lunch. This way I could save the money for a meal. Not wanting to waste time resting, I took out my English book and started to recite words. However, just after reciting 3 words, someone sat on my desk. I looked up. It was Zachary. His family bribed their way, and also got him into our high school. He was in the class next to mine. Because he was rich and a ruffian, he became a bully in the next class. Zachary had lost some weight. But his chubby round face didn't look any better even after losing weight. He knocked on my desk with his hand and smiled maliciously. What? Came out of a small hotel with your brother? When I heard the words, small hotel, my mind buzzed. Fortunately, there were only the 2 of us in the class at this moment. I pushed him off the desk and pretended to be calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Zachary smiled lewdly. What? Don't recognize people after putting on your pants? Yolanda. I wonder how your poor brother became such a good Samaritan and insisted on making money to support your studies. It turns out it was for bedtime amusement. Slap. I couldn't bear to listen anymore and swung my hand over. In the first 10+ years of my life, I was displaced and had always been obedient and cowardly. But since Andrew took me home, I had someone to rely on and my character had gradually become a little tougher. Zachary covered his face in disbelief. Damn it. You dared to hit me? Yes. I took a deep breath. If you keep slandering him with such dirty words, I'll hit you again. He's just my brother. Nothing happened between us. Believe it or not. Don't think everyone is as dirty as you. Zachary suddenly laughed. I'm dirty? He took a step forward, raised his eyebrows and smiled. Of course I'm dirty. Which man in this world doesn't like this kind of dirty thing? By the way, isn't Dora your good friend? You can go and learn from her when you have time. Ask her how she usually serves me. You! I looked at him in disbelief. Are you crazy? Liu Duo is your sister. What sister? He sneered. She was picked up. My grandfather picked her up and brought her home originally to be my wife. Suddenly, I remembered that on the snowy day when Dora was punished to stand outside. When she came to give me pastries, she walked strangely. I also remembered when I told Andrew about it later. The indignation and helplessness in his eyes. So that's how it was. This beast. I was trembling with anger. When I wanted to raise my hand to slap him again, my wrist was firmly grasped by him. Zachary was much stronger than me. He held me tightly and said with a cold smile, "Don't be shameless. You girls who were abducted are just cheap lives. What kind of resistance do you still want to make? Come to room 201 of the small hotel to find me after school today. If you don't come," he sneered, "then the story of you sleeping with your brother will spread all over the school." After saying that, he shook off my hand and turned around and walked out of the classroom door. I stared at the empty doorway for a long time. What flashed before my eyes was Dora's lonely and staggering figure when she left on that snowy day. I lay on the desk and cried. Cry for Dora. And not just for Dora. Cry for girls like us. Who are like duckweed-s. Adrift and unstable. A life may not be as valuable as a dog raised by a rich family. If it weren't for Andrew, my situation would be no better than Dora's. After class, Zachary came to me again. All he said was to remind me to go to room 201 after school and such things. He is a well-known troublemaker in the next class. Suddenly coming to me. The classmates beside were all looking at me quietly. I don't know if anyone heard what Zachary whispered to me. I was too busy to pay attention to him. I opened my book and continued to do math problems. Every minute I spend at school is earned by Andrew with his sweat. I'm not qualified to waste it. After school in the evening, of course, I didn't go to that small hotel as Zachary said. As usual, I went to the cafeteria to buy a steamed bun and a pack of pickled mustard tuber. Then took them back to the dormitory and ate them with hot water. And studied by the lamp. The night passed without incident. However, the next day, as usual, I went to the class early to study. But was blocked by Zachary at the classroom door again. I didn't want to have much contact with him. So I turned around and went downstairs. But he blocked me first. I waited in the room all night last night. He reached out and pressed against the wall, in a pose that he thought was very handsome. But actually, from my angle, I could just see several stubbornly protruding nose hairs of his. So disgusting. I didn't dare to speak. For fear of vomiting. Not giving face? I looked at him coldly. Zachary, I'm not interested in you. And it's impossible for me to fall in love in high school. If you keep pestering me, I will go to the grade director. If you come to say some indecent words again, I will call the police. Zachary suddenly laughed. Not fall in love in high school? You sound like a chaste woman. But in fact, didn't you and your brother go to the small hotel? Fine. I gave you a solution. But you didn't listen. Then I can't help you hide your dirty business with your brother anymore. Before he finished speaking, I turned around and left. This kind of scoundrel. Even if I softened and begged him, he would still spread the rumors. Anyway, the clean ones are clean themselves. Sure enough, the rumors spread instantly. In just one morning, the looks of my classmates in the class had changed. They were teasing, ambiguous, and full of sarcasm. I took a deep breath, pretended not to see it, and continued to study with my head down. I thought the matter would soon subside. However, with Zachary fanning the flames, those rumors became even more rampant for a while. Wherever I went, people were talking about it. I gritted my teeth and endured it, trying my best not to listen to those voices. Anyway, I don't have any friends in the class. They are just classmates. After graduation into years, who will remember whom? However, I didn't expect that the matter would get bigger and bigger, and the rumors even reached the teacher's ears. A few days later, I was called to the teacher's office by the head teacher. Despite my best efforts to explain, my parents were still called. I don't know what Andrew was feeling at the moment when he received the call. All I know is that it takes 20 minutes to get from the construction site to the school. But he arrived in just over 10 minutes. Moreover, in order not to embarrass me, he specially changed into a white shirt and shaved his beard. When he entered, he walked slowly, deliberately concealing the defect of his leg. Teacher Liu. After he went in, I was driven out of the office by the head teacher. I don't know what they said. Andrew came out 20 minutes later. He pushed the door open. There was a hint of fatigue on his face. But when he saw me, he was stunned for a moment. Why haven't you gone back to class? I'm waiting for you. I walked forward. Bit my lip. Brother. I'm sorry. He rubbed my hair, his voice very soft. What are you sorry for? You haven't done anything wrong. Don't think too much. Go back to class. His hand pinched my face. Don't worry. You have your brother. I went back to the class and sat down. Andrew happened to pass by the door of our class. Because of his leg injury, he walked slowly. But he didn't look into the class. I heard two girls in the back seat whispering in a low voice. Is that guy in the white shirt outside from our school? So handsome. Probably not. He is really handsome. But it's a pity that he seems too limp a little when he walks. I opened my book and left the whispers behind. I need to study. I can only study desperately. After school, when I was eating a steamed bun in the dormitory, I accidentally heard my roommates who came back whispering. Have you heard? Zachary, the troublemaker in the next class, was beaten. Really? Who dares to beat him? It was in the alley on our street. It is said that the other side was a group of migrant workers. Hearing the word, migrant workers, my hand holding the steamed bun froze instantly. And then I heard them say again, I don't know how Zachary offended those people. A leading boy was quite young, handsome, and hit hard. But it seemed that there was something wrong with his leg. Before she finished speaking, I had already run out of the dormitory. There were some classmates gathered at the entrance of the alley. I pushed through the crowd and saw Andrew at a glance. I had never seen him like this. That always gentle boy was now clutching Zachary's collar with one hand, punching him hard, and warning him harshly not to come to trouble me again. Brother! I ran up to stop him. Stop hitting. If you break him, we don't have money to compensate. Only when I stopped him did Andrew stop his hands. Under him, Zachary's nose was bleeding. His clothes were torn, and he was in a sorry state with a dusty face. Seeing Andrew stop, he hurriedly staggered to his feet. Without daring to say another word, he turned around and ran away. Andrew looked at his back faintly and said, Don't let me find you pestering Yolanda again. Otherwise, every time I see you, I'll beat you up. Zachary's running away figure froze for a moment and he didn't dare to speak. I held his hand and looked at it carefully. The back of his hand was rubbed red. I felt extremely distressed and was about to take him to buy some ointment to rub on it, when Andrew suddenly withdrew his hand. He casually wiped the back of his hand on his work clothes, took a step back, and distanced himself from me. He smiled and said, I came in a hurry and didn't change my work clothes. There are a lot of people gathered at the entrance of the alley. It's not good if your classmates see. Then, he whispered to me to eat on time, and left with his co-workers, acting as if he was not familiar with me. Andrew had always been like this. He considered everything for me and always put himself last. I followed at a not too close nor too far distance behind. When we reached the entrance of the alley, I shouted towards his back. Brother. Be careful on the road. Andrew's leaving figure froze for a moment. Turning around, he smiled and said, "Okay." 16's Zachary had been a bully the weak and fear the strong persons since he was a child. Since he was beaten up by Andrew and his men in the alley, he didn't dare to come to trouble me again. Those extremely unpleasant rumors about me were gradually forgotten. Of course, occasionally, someone would mention them, but I just pretended not to hear and continued to study earnestly. Anyway, I was used to being alone. And having Andrew was enough for me. I didn't need friends. This state lasted until the sophomore year of high school. At the beginning of the sophomore year, a girl transferred to our class. Yuna. She walked onto the podium, introduced herself gracefully, and then, without hesitation, walked to the empty seat beside me and sat down. Thus, we became desk mates. Our personalities were completely different. She was enthusiastic, generous, and lively, and there was always passion burning in her eyes. And I silent, forbearing, and dull. In my world, besides studying, there was only studying. Of course, there was also Andrew. But such different as we were, we became very good friends. Yuna often took me to her home. Her mother was a music teacher, very gentle and enthusiastic. In her home, I came into contact with musical instruments such as the piano and the guitar for the first time. I liked them indescribably. We hid in her room and sang. When Mrs. Sue heard us, she was inspired to correct some of our vocal techniques. That was my first direct and real contact with music. Suddenly, a seed was planted in my heart and quietly bloomed, side by side with the one planted by Andrew in my heart. In the days that followed, I still studied hard and didn't dare to slack off at all. But, besides studying, I was completely obsessed with music. Mrs. Sue said that I was very talented in music. But I had no money and no time to study music. With my mediocre skills, in the second semester of the sophomore year, I quietly wrote an immature song. I named it High Mountain Andrew. I hoped that one day, I could really have it composed and sing it to Andrew. 17 soon. The high school career was coming to an end. After 3 years of hard study. At this moment, there were 13 days left before the college entrance examination. After school, when I was eating buns and reciting English words in the dormitory, suddenly a roommate came back and told me that someone was waiting for me at the school gate. I thought it was Andrew. However, when I went out to have a look, it was Dora. She was wearing a black gray dress and had her hair in a ponytail. She waved at me with a smile and said, "Yolanda, come here quickly." I hadn't seen Dora for a long time. Andrew's house was sold, and we had nowhere to go back. According to Dora's situation, Old Man Lee didn't let her leave that small mountain village either. She carried a bag of snacks and enthusiastically stuffed them into my hands. "Eat quickly. These are all bought for you. Where did you get the money?" Dora smiled, with a bit of loneliness in her eyes. "I earned it. Now, I left the Liu family and am working in the county town alone with my child." "Child? Whose child?" Dora was still smiling. "My child." At that moment, I couldn't describe what kind of feeling I had in my heart. 2 years ago, Zachary's words about how Dora served him instantly turned into sharp blades and stabbed heavily into my heart at this moment. Taking a deep breath, I asked her softly, "Is the child Zachary's?" Dora was stunned for a moment and shook her head. "It's his grandfather's. Old Man Liu? He, beast. The whole family are beasts." I was so angry that my body trembled, and I couldn't say a word. Dora looked at me, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and forced a smile. "My rented house is near your school. At this time, the neighbor is taking care of my child. Are you free this evening? Let's go to my home and talk." Saying that, she reached out and hugged me. "Yolanda, I miss you so much." My nose tingled and I turned around to hug her. In my life, I have no parents. Besides Andrew, I only have two friends. Yuna, whom I got to know later, and Dora, whose life has been more bumpy than mine. In these 2 years, I have often thought of her. I thought of the time when we used to play together, and of how every time she had something delicious, she was reluctant to eat it all, and secretly saved half for me, looking like she was presenting a precious treasure. Dora and I chatted all the way back to her home. I had originally planned to sit for a while, have a look at her living environment and then go back to study. However, after the door was closed, I saw Zachary sitting beside the bed. Why is he here? Beside me. Dora picked up the several-month-old baby from the bed, her eyes dodging and not daring to look at me. She sobbed softly. Yolanda, I'm sorry. He threatened me with the baby. I'm sorry. She gently rocked the baby in her arms, not daring to look at me at all. There was no time to argue with her about this. I turned around and ran. At night, Zachary made Dora deceive me into coming here. What on earth was he plotting? One could figure it out even without thinking. However, I was still a step too late. Obviously, my right hand had already pressed on the doorknob, but I was still dragged back by Zachary forcibly. A teen slaps rained down on me. Obviously, Zachary wanted to beat me into submission first and break my will to resist and escape. But he probably didn't expect that I would resist so fiercely. I struggled desperately to break free from his restraints. If my hands were pinned, I would kick with my feet. If my feet were also restrained, I would use my head to butt. Zachary was made very embarrassed by me when he pinned me to the ground and freed one hand to tear at my clothes. I picked up everything within reach and threw them at him. The room was in chaos. The baby in Dora's arms was frightened by the fighting noises and cried loudly. After all, my strength was far inferior to Zachary's. Despite my desperate resistance, in the end I was still pinned down firmly by him. He picked up the ashtray beside him and smashed it on my head without hesitation. There was a sharp pain in my head and instantly everything went black before my eyes. It hurt so much. Something was flowing down. The bright red gradually blurred my vision. It was blood. Why are you not so wild anymore? Zachary's cold laugh came from above my head. Weren't you so good at pretending? Pa! He spat on my face. What a thing. 2 years ago, I already said that I would definitely sleep with you. As he said this, he threw away the blood-stained ashtray and reached out to tear my clothes. My head was so dizzy. The blood kept flowing. I reached out to stop him, but I had even less strength. No matter how much I struggled, my clothes were still torn off by him. Beside me were Dora's and the baby's cries. Suddenly, she knelt down in front of Zachary. I'm begging you. Let Yolanda go. She is about to take the college entrance examination. Zachary casually slapped her and cursed. What's it to you? Get lost. Pretending to be so affectionate as sisters? It was you who deceived your good sister here. Dora was still kicked away by him while holding the baby. My head was getting dizzier and dizzier. I bit my tongue tip desperately to stay awake. But my strength to resist was still getting weaker and weaker. The clothes on my body were getting fewer and fewer. In the end, there was only a piece of cloth left to cover my body. I trembled, completely in despair. However, when he was about to tear off my last piece of clothing, Andrew's voice actually sounded outside the door. Was it my illusion? I opened my eyes wide, and then I heard the sound of kicking the door. Once, twice. After a dull thud, the door was kicked open. Andrew's figure actually appeared in my sight. He just looked at me once, and his eyes instantly turned red. 21 When Andrew picked me up from the ground, his hands were trembling. He covered me with his coat, preserving my last bit of dignity. After putting me on the bedside, he took a deep breath. Then he turned around. Perhaps he was beaten so badly by Andrew 2 years ago that when he saw Andrew again, Zachary's originally arrogant ear, He froze for 2 seconds and then suddenly turned his head to look at Dora. Stinking bitch. Did you tell him the address? Dora was holding the baby and crying softly. Without refuting, Andrew walked slowly towards Zachary. Although his leg was lame, his aura was terrifying. He was really angry. At this moment, he pinned Zachary under him and punched him hard. Zachary's face was covered with blood. If he continued to fight like this, something bad would happen. But at this time, Dora stood aside and suddenly said, "Brother Andrew, I have a secret. I have been hesitating whether to tell you or not." She was default by Zachary in the first place, and that's why she died on the mountain. Andrew's hand instantly froze in mid-air. Even I was so shocked that I couldn't say a word. Ju, when he, Andrew's sister who died miserably on the mountain, and was devoured by wolves back then. 19 Hearing this, Zachary instantly broke down. "You bitch. Do you want him to kill me?" Turning his head to meet Andrew's blood-red eyes, he instantly wilted and his voice trembled as he explained, "I didn't. Brother. She's lying. Your sister was clearly eaten by wolves. How could it have anything to do with me? It was him." Dora held the baby in one arm and pointed at him with the other. "I learned it from a child in the village." That day she also went up the mountain to pick things and accidentally saw Zachary molesting Hihi. But she was young and timid at that time, afraid that the same thing would happen to her as to Hihi. She didn't dare to tell anyone. He and his grandfather are both beasts. Brutes. There's nothing they wouldn't do. Zachary was completely panicked. "I didn't. I really didn't. I just thought she was cute and hugged and kissed her in the mountains. I swear. I just touched her a little. I didn't do anything else." She fell down the mountain by herself and was eaten by wolves. He was so flustered that he blurted out everything and admitted it all. Seeing Andrew's instantly gloomy expression, my heart sank. "Brother." I wanted to step forward to stop him, but I had just lost too much blood. After taking just 2 steps, I was tripped over by some sundries due to dizziness. When I looked up, Andrew had already picked up a chair beside him and smashed it hard on Zachary's head. Blood spattered everywhere. Zachary was motionless on the spot. Andrew's eyes were scarlet, and the chair he held high still seemed to have the intention of hitting again. "Brother." I almost crawled over and stopped him. "Stop hitting. If you keep hitting, someone will die." I held him tightly and didn't dare to let go at all. I don't know how long it had passed. Andrew threw away the chair and staggered to sit on the ground. He was silent for a long time. Then he buried his face in his palms. He cried. This was the first time I had seen Andrew cry. In my heart, he had always been omnipotent. Those thin shoulders could always hold up the whole world for me. But at this moment, he hung his head and cried bitterly. His sister's death had always been a pain in his heart. That well-behaved and sensible sister, who depended on him, was buried in the belly of wolves. It was already a hurdle he couldn't get over. Now, knowing that she had endured such unbearable humiliation before her death, I didn't even dare to think about Andrew's feelings at this moment. After a long time, he raised his head, red-eyed, and dialed the police number. Soon, the ambulance stopped downstairs, and the medical staff carried a stretcher up and carried Zachary into the ambulance. And Andrew and I were taken away by the police who arrived later. There were 11 days left until the college entrance examination. Zachary was declared dead after the rescue was ineffective. Andrew, as the murderer, was arrested by the police. Old Man Lee wailed while holding a banner at the entrance of the police station all day long, saying that his grandson was dead. His family line was cut off, and he wanted Andrew to pay with his life. Dora also reported the case. She sued Zachary and Old Man Liu for their years of molestation of her. The first time she was forced by those two beasts, grandfather and grandson. She was even less than 14 years old. After the investigation, Old Man Liu successfully went from the entrance of the police station to inside the police station. He was also arrested. Doing such inhumane things to a minor, and even a girl who was less than 14 years old at that time, due to the heinous circumstances. According to Article 236 of the criminal law, Old Man Liu was sentenced to death with a reprieve. It was just a pity. Zachary died too easily. Whenever I thought that Andrew's only sister had been molested and insulted by Zachary before being eaten by wolves, I felt a stabbing pain in my heart. If I felt this way, how much more so Andrew? The day before the college entrance examination, I met Andrew once. He was wearing a prison uniform, looking haggard, with large dark circles under his eyes. I had prepared a bunch of things to say, but at this moment they were all stuck in my chest and I couldn't say a word. Instead, tears fell down in a stream. Brother, Andrew was the nicest boy I had ever met. Gentle, firm, and kind. He didn't deserve this. He smiled at me. At the moment he saw me, the originally dead-looking eyes gradually regained their luster. Don't cry. He looked at me and smiled. His tone was calm and gentle, but it gave me the illusion that he was making arrangements for his affairs after his death. He told me softly that there was a bank card in the box under his dormitory bed. The password was my birthday, and all his savings were in it. The money in it was for me to study music. He smiled. Brother's life is like this already. But I hope you can follow the path you like. If one day I can get out of prison, I hope to hear Yolanda's song spread all over the streets and alleys. I choked back my sobs and said yes. He would definitely get out. And I would definitely show him. But, at this time, neither of us was confident. After all, a homicide was involved. What if Andrew was sentenced to death? I didn't dare to think about it. I was crying so hard that I could hardly breathe. In comparison, Andrew was much calmer. His eyes were always red as he gently comforted me. When he left, he looked at me quietly. I'm fine. Don't let these things affect you. Tomorrow, do well in the college entrance examination. Don't let brother down. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand. Okay. 3 years of hard study. It was not me who suffered, but Andrew. For this last exam, I didn't dare to let him down. Even if, at this moment, he couldn't see it. 21 The college entrance examination went smoothly. I performed normally, and should be able to be admitted to my ideal college. The moment I walked out of the examination room, I didn't think about anything. I left numbly, but didn't know where to go back to. The dormitory? I couldn't just stay in the dormitory during the vacation after the college entrance examination. Go home? For my schooling. Andrew's old house had been sold. With nowhere to go, I found a part-time job that provided food and accommodation. Every day I worked desperately, and every penny I earned was deposited into the card and left me. I begged people everywhere. I even went to see the most famous lawyer in the city, hoping that he could save Andrew. But I didn't even get to see the other party at all. In desperation, I thought of the leader on Andrew's construction site, Charles. On his business card, his name was clearly written as Charles. I dialed his number. In the coffee shop. It was my first time to come to such a place. I was very restrained. Holding the warm coffee cup in both hands, I looked at the man opposite me helplessly. To be honest, Charles was very young. Judging from his appearance and temperament, he really didn't look like a contractor. Charles took a sip of coffee and looked at me. Tell me, what exactly happened that day? Andrew doesn't seem like an impulsive person. So I told him briefly. After I finished, Charles frowned and cursed in a low voice. Beast. Of course. These 2 words were for Zachary, who was already dead. After calming down, Charles took a sip of coffee and agreed. I'll take care of Andrew's matter. I'll find a lawyer. I thanked him repeatedly. But the next second, he handed back the bank card. Take the card back. The money was left to you by Andrew. Go back. Go to school if you should. Study music if you should. I'm Andrew's boss. It's only natural for me to help him with a lawsuit. No matter what I said, Charles refused to take this card. After drinking the coffee in one gulp, Charles stood up. Drink slowly. I've paid the bill. I'll leave first. Charles was very efficient. The next day, I received his call. He said that he had already hired a lawyer. And it was exactly the great lawyer whom I had visited 3 times but hadn't even got to see. 22 Andrew's judgment came out. The court judged that he was manslaughter. Actively called the police. Finally, the court sentenced him to 12 years in prison. 12 years. The best 12 years of Andrew's life need to be spent in prison. I didn't dare to think about it. Whenever I thought of Andrew's face on the prison uniform, I felt stuffy in my chest. So stuffy that I could hardly breathe. Some media got the news about Zachary's matter. After conducting interviews, they wrote a series of things and sent them to the internet. The news became an instant hit. Zachary became popular again after his death and was scolded by countless netizens. A classmate who had been bullied by him at school also exposed his deeds on the internet one after another. Unfortunately, Zachary couldn't hear these scoldings. Some netizens were so angry. Couldn't hear? That's not okay. An enthusiastic netizen who was hundreds of kilometers away drove all the way here, managed to find out where Zachary's grave was, and dug up his grave overnight. Andrew's village was too remote, and still practiced in Humayun. People who died in the village would be buried in the back mountain. The next morning, a villager went to the back mountain, and saw at a glance that Zachary's already rotting bones had been dug out and exposed in the wilderness. There was also a broken mobile phone beside it, which was looping and scolding that all the people in the Liu family should die out. When alive, old Mr. Liu's family, relying on being the richest in the village, had done a lot of things like bullying men and women. And they didn't have a good reputation in the village. Therefore, no one cared about Zachary's grave being dug up. After being exposed in the wilderness for half a month, there were not many of Zachary's bones left. As for the enthusiastic netizen, because he sent this matter to the internet, after the news fermented, he was reported and detained for 10 days. However, this enthusiastic netizen became popular overnight, and was nicknamed Graveyard Judge by people.